The Marvel Cinematic Universe has single-handedly transformed the film landscape of the 21st century. Sure, there were superhero movies before it, and yes, major studio franchises are nothing new, but a shared universe concept that mixed genres, defied source material conventions, and managed regularly to produce quality cinema was unheard of, and was a laughable prospect only 15 years ago. Now the MCU is practically a money-making machine that Disney will be milking for the foreseeable future, and since it tends to include good movies and shows, audiences are pretty happy about that, all things considered. But one positive element of the MCU that often goes understated is just how much it took from the comics it's based on that it then greatly improved. Some of those improvements, like the inclusion of a soundtrack and better visuals, are built into the medium transfer from comics to film, but then there are the bold changes to Marvel's historic continuity. These have been used to fix problems by bygone eras, refresh stale or boring characters to be more interesting, or just to make better creative choices that improve the overall quality of the narrative. And so with that, I am Kirsten from What Culture, and these are 10 ways that the MCU improved Marvel mythology. Number 10. Captain Mar-VELL'S identity. While 2019's Captain Marvel is widely regarded as one of the weaker movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it is responsible for some of the most drastic improvements from the comics, and one of the biggest is the change of Captain Mar-Vell. In the comics, Mar-Vell was a male commander in the Kree military, who defected to defend Earth as the first Captain Marvel. During his adventures, he protected Carol Danvers from an explosion, and as a result, she was imbued with a portion of his DNA and attained some of his powers. She took on the moniker Miss Marvel and later adapted to Captain Marvel when Mar-Vell died. While most of the broader elements of this origin are kept the same, the specifics are greatly changed in the movie. For starters, Mar-Vell is now a female Kree sent to spy on Earth's burgeoning celestial endeavours. Instead of defending for Earth, she defects to help the SKRULLS, reimagined as alien refugees, and enlists Carol's help to keep a light-speed engine from falling into Kree hands. To fulfill her mentor's dying wish, Carol destroys the engine, and the resulting explosion gifts her with cosmic powers. This changes the narrative completely, from a woman stumbling into powers given to her by a man to a woman passing the mantle of a progressive initiative to empowering a younger successor. Number 9. SKRULLS as refugees. From their inception, the SKRULLS have been one of the most insidious races Stan Lee ever created. Their innate ability to shapeshift made them perfect foes for the Secret Invasion storyline, and forced readers to retrace their steps, trying to figure out when certain characters could have been replaced and what that meant for the continuity. So when it came to adapt one of the most iconic villains in the comics to film in Captain Marvel, Kevin Feige decided to pull a fast one and subvert the audience's expectations. Anticipating that they would assume the SKRULLS would be the evil alien empire they were in the comics, the film maintained that illusion about 2/3 of the way through, at which point it's revealed that the SKRULLS were not invading conquerors, but rather fleeing refugees, nearly hunted to extinction because people assumed their powers made them dangerous. On top of being a great swerve that allowed the grand scheme of the MCU to grow from its source material, this painted a whole new level for it to grow on. It was revealed in the post-credit scene of Spider-Man Far From Home that the SKRULLS from Captain Marvel, Talos and Soren had been impersonating Nick Fury and Maria Hill for an indeterminate amount of time. And since they're good guys in the MCU and can't do Secret Invasion, what does that mean for Phase 4? Number 8. Civil War being understandable. Many comic fans lament this Civil War storyline as a case of lost potential. The massive crossover event was kicked off with a botched raid on a supervillain safe house that resulted in a mass murder and sparked a discussion in the superhero community about how and if it should be policed. Unfortunately, motives and politics were very poorly handled, and things were only getting more convoluted as the battle lines were drawn. Fortunately, the MCU had the benefit of hindsight, and while it touched on the notion of superhero politics with the Sokovia Accords, the focus was quickly drawn to whether or not the Winter Soldier deserved to be protected. And even though it didn't really matter in the end because both sides were being manipulated by Zemo, the emotions that sparked the conflict were still there, and through one final revelation became much more personal, and led to one last blow-off between the principal parties of the war. To date, it's one of the MCU's best stories, in no small part because it was a drastic improvement over the source material. Number 7. Thanos' motivation. From his debut, the Mad Titan Thanos has always been one of the single greatest threats of the entire Marvel canon. The self-described ultimate nihilist was an alien super genius, accomplished warlock, and brilliant strategist, and that's without his infamous Infinity Gauntlet. But while he was a terrifying villain in the comics, the MCU did an inarguably better job of presenting his character. In the comics, Thanos was a once promising child of the race of Eternals that colonized Titan. However, he threw away his potential in an attempt to woo the esoteric concept of death, who presented itself to him as a beautiful woman. His love for her drove him to create destructive weapons, conquer worlds, and ignited his crusade to kill as many things as possible as a gift for her. The movies present a different, more somber Thanos. Instead of trying to court death, he takes an objective view to the problem of overpopulation and sees that the most efficient solution is also the simplest. A massive cull eliminating half of all life in the universe to free up resources and ensure equality throughout the galaxy. He doesn't see himself as a hopeless romantic, but a reluctant hero who will sacrifice everything, even those he views as family, to save the universe from itself, making him a much more compelling villain. Number 6. Improved comedy. To say that comics should be funny is redundant. The first modern comics were humorous pulp strips in newspapers designed to poke fun at politics, culture, and entertainment. However, as the superhero genre became synonymous with the medium, comics have often waylaid humour to be a novelty, almost always playing second fiddle to the narrative and character development. However, adapting these characters and stories to a moving visual media like film afforded the MCU the ability to make comedy a feature of their content, not a byproduct. Take, for example, Tony Stark in the first Iron Man movie. A lot of his dialogue reads as obnoxious and arrogant, which is very intentional as that is his character at that point in his life. However, he doesn't come off as unlikable because these lines are delivered by Robert Downey Jr., an actor with impeccable comic timing and a frightening amount of charisma. And it quickly expanded from there, with characters who were formerly one-note or almost anti-humour in the comics being repackaged as comedy set pieces. Sure, the comics made jokes over the years, but it never reached the level of mirth and levity that the films provide. Number 5. More character growth. One of Stan Lee's greatest storytelling inventions wasn't a character, but Marvel's famous floating timeline, which allowed decades of comics to exist in a few years' worth of continuity while always staying up to date with current events. It was a genius move that has arguably done more for Marvel's narrative than any one intellectual property, but it did have an unintended side effect. Because years' worth of comics translated to a much shorter time in the Marvel universe, characters were not able to grow as they probably should. Fortunately, the MCU has done away with this problem by having the movies largely take place in real time. The Iron Man in Civil War is completely different from the Iron Man that was introduced in his first title movie, because since then he has battled alcoholism, had a near-death experience in space, retired, and helped build a genocidal AI. And because he had years to process these events, his character was allowed to grow and change accordingly, something his comic counterpart has never managed to successfully do for very long. Number 4. The Mandarin reveals. At the time, the big Mandarin fake-out in Iron Man 3 divided fans. The Mandarin had long been one of Iron Man's most prominent villains in the comics, but had also been a very problematic Asian stereotype. So the reveal that Ben Kingsley's version of the character was actually a propaganda mouthpiece for AIM incensed die-hard fans of the comics who had been anticipating a perfect adaptation delivered by a venerated actor, and relieved fans who were concerned about seeing a racist caricature on screen. But time has been kind to this creative decision, and most of the fandom have gotten behind Kingsley's washed-up English actor, Trevor Slattery, helped in no small part by the hilarious reveal, which definitely softened the blow. It was also helped by the one-shot All Hail the King, which revealed that there is in fact a real Mandarin hiding in the MCU somewhere, and is expected to appear in the Phase 4 Shang-Chi movie. And while he may present a problem in that film, it was definitely a good idea to skip over him for Iron Man 3. It avoided a bigger controversy, got one of the biggest laughs the MCU ever delivered, and the one-shot hinted that Trevor Slattery might make a reappearance. Number 3. Star-Lord's personality. Perhaps the best creative decision that the MCU ever made was hiring James Gunn to direct the Guardians of the Galaxy franchise. The success of Gunn's gonzo filmmaking style, paired with the House of Mouse's money, opened up the doors for the likes of Taika Waititi and Ryan Coogler to make their own unique stamp on the Marvel Studios brand, but it also completely reinvented one of the key Guardians. In the comics, Peter Quill, aka Star-Lord, was a much more advanced person than the character Gunn and Chris Pratt presented in the MCU. He was a grown man who was much more of a straight-laced leader type, like Cyclops or Captain America, just in space. But Gunn decided it was better to have the character be in perpetual arrested development, unable to cope with the loss of his mother, and using his rogue charm and spacefaring adventures to keep himself from processing his own guilt. It was a much more nuanced take on what had previously been a very stereotypical sci-fi character. This was even reflected in the comics, where he changed to his more famous swashbuckling personality. Number 2. Hawkeye's importance. Hawkeye has always been something of an underrated character in the comics. This makes sense because he still uses a bow and arrow in the 21st century, and this is supposed to make him as powerful as Iron Man or Thor. However, the MCU has treated him very differently, and with the respect that the comics never outright gave him. Though many consider his role as a member of the Avengers to be a joke, the film set him up to be the heart and soul of the team, a central figure who doesn't lead them but is integral to keeping them together. The reveal of him being a family man in Age of Ultron is what motivates the team to rally, and the loss of his family during the events of Infinity War made him the driving emotional force behind Endgame. His brief relationship with Quicksilver was the only thing that ever gave the character any real depth, and his dark turn to the Ronin persona was the most impactful way to establish how low the heroes had fallen. He may not have gotten his own movie just yet, but the MCU has all but made Hawkeye a crucial player in its grand narrative. Number 1. The one and only Nick Fury. The Nick Fury in the MCU is not actually a representation of the original character in the comics. Debuting in 1963, the original Nick Fury wasn't only a younger James Bond-style secret agent leading the Howling Commandos squad, but he was also white. The Samuel L. Jackson-based Nick Fury most audiences are familiar with originated in the early 2000s in Marvel's now defunct Ultimate line, and he remains one of the few good creative choices to come out of that alternate timeline. However, he was never a character in the main Marvel continuity. Until that is, he came out in full force during 2012's Avengers. Once Samuel L. Jackson had firmly established that his version, the cool, experienced, and manipulative director of S.H.I.E.L.D., was the superior version, the comics introduced Nick Fury Jr., the white Nick Fury's secret illegitimate son who happened to look an awful lot like the movie version. There's almost no point in comparing the new and the old versions of the character. One was from a pulp era where Cold War spy thrillers could only get so graphic, and the other is Samuel L. Jackson if he ran an organisation of spies and had a team of superheroes at his beck and call. There's a clear winner between the two. And there we go, the 10 ways that the MCU improved Marvel mythology. So let us know your favourites down in the comments below. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, click that subscribe button as well as the little bell icon to be notified of any new videos coming your way. But for now, I have been Kirsten Ria from What Culture, and I'll see you in the next video.